The airport was packed. People rushed to their gates, dragging suitcases and grabbing last-minute coffee. For most, this was just another flight. But for Captain David Carter, this trip meant everything. He wasn't traveling for business or vacation. He was on a mission to escort a fallen soldier home. But when he reached the check-in counter, the airline refused to accommodate him. "Sorry, sir, we can't make exceptions." What happened next? It left the entire airport speechless. Before we continue the story, let us know, where are you watching from? Captain David Carter had served in the military for over 15 years. He had seen war, loss, and sacrifice. But this mission, this was different. He wasn't carrying a weapon or leading a unit. He was escorting a fallen soldier home. A young Marine, barely in his 20s, who had given everything for his country. David had done this before, and every time it weighed on him. This wasn't just a flight. It was a responsibility, a final act of honor for a hero who couldn't make the journey himself. The airport was just like any other day. Passengers rushing, flights being announced, businessmen checking emails. No one realized the weight of what David was carrying. When he reached the check-in counter, he calmly handed over his documents. He had done this before. There was always a process. The airlines were usually understanding. But today, the woman behind the counter barely looked at the papers before shaking her head. "I'm sorry, sir. We can't accommodate special requests." David remained calm. "I'm escorting a fallen soldier. I just need—" "Sir, I understand," she interrupted, but her tone said otherwise. "Rules are rules." David felt his stomach tighten. He wasn't asking for special treatment for himself. This was about respect. And he wasn't about to back down. David took a deep breath, keeping his emotions in check. He had faced difficult situations before. Combat zones, life-or-death decisions, moments where everything depended on a single choice. But this wasn't supposed to be one of those moments. He looked at the airline employee and spoke again, slower this time. "Ma'am, I understand policies, but I am escorting a fallen soldier home. I need to be there when they load the casket. I need early boarding, not for me, but for the honor of the man who gave his life for this country." The employee barely glanced up. "Sir, I already told you, there are no exceptions. If you want early boarding, you can purchase a priority upgrade." David's patience thinned. She wasn't listening. This wasn't about rules. This was about respect. He exhaled sharply. "I don't think you understand what I'm saying. I'm not asking for a favor. This is standard protocol for military escorts." The employee sighed, clearly annoyed. "Sir, I don't make the rules." A man behind David, older, with gray at his temples, stepped forward. His voice was calm but firm. "Excuse me, miss. I've flown many times when a fallen soldier was on board. The airline has always honored the escort's request." A woman beside him nodded. "It's the right thing to do." More people in the line were listening now. Some whispered among themselves, shaking their heads. They knew this was wrong. But the employee didn't care. She tapped a few keys on her computer, not even looking up. "Sir, like I said, I can't do anything about this." David clenched his jaw. He wasn't the type to cause a scene. But this wasn't about him. This was about a young Marine who wasn't coming home the way he should have. He placed both hands on the counter and met her gaze. "Then get me someone who can." The line behind him was getting longer. More passengers were paying attention. Another man, wearing a veteran's cap, stepped forward. His voice was gravelly, filled with authority. "Ma'am, you need to rethink this. That soldier gave his life for your freedom. The least you can do is show some respect." The employee's face turned red. She glanced nervously at the people now watching. "Sir, She started, but then another voice cut in. "Is there a problem here?" David turned to see a man in uniform. The flight captain. The airline employee immediately straightened up. Her dismissive tone was gone. The pilot's sharp eyes scanned the scene. "Captain Carter?" David nodded. "Yes, sir." The pilot extended his hand, shaking David's firmly. Then he turned to the airline employee. "What's the issue?" he asked. The woman fumbled for words. He's requesting an exception for early boarding, but our policy doesn't allow it." The pilot's eyes hardened. "This isn't an exception," he said, voice steady. "This is protocol." The employee shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, we have rules in place." The pilot cut her off. "And one of those rules states that military escorts have the highest priority when accompanying a fallen soldier." She paled. David stayed silent, letting the moment unfold. The pilot turned to him. "Captain, you will board first, and I will personally make sure that soldier is given the honor he deserves." Passengers in line nodded, whispering in agreement. Some looked at David with quiet respect. A woman near the front spoke softly. "Thank you for your service, sir." A young man beside her nodded, and for his. David felt a weight lift, not for himself, but because this soldier would not be forgotten. The employee, now realizing her mistake, nervously adjusted her uniform. I didn't mean to be disrespectful." The pilot's eyes stayed on her. "It's not about what you meant. It's about what you did." David could see the regret on her face, but he didn't care about apologies. He turned back to the pilot. "Thank you, sir." The captain nodded. "It's the least we can do." Then something unexpected happened. A man in a suit, standing a few rows back, stepped forward. "Captain Carter," he said, voice steady, "I'm with corporate. I just got off a call with our senior executives. This should have never happened." The airline employee's face went white. The man continued. "On behalf of the airline, I sincerely apologize. Not only will you board first, but we will ensure that every passenger on this flight is aware of the presence of this fallen soldier." David was silent for a moment. Then he nodded. "Thank you," he said. The corporate representative turned to the employee. "Step aside. I'll handle the rest." The woman, now completely embarrassed, moved away from the counter. David handed his papers to the representative, who quickly processed everything. "Captain," the man said, "I hope this flight honors the soldier the way he deserves." David exhaled. "So do I." When it was time to board, the entire flight waited. No one moved until David was on first. No one complained. Passengers stood in silence as the fallen soldier's casket was loaded. Some placed hands over their hearts. Others whispered prayers. Even the airline employee who had denied David's request stood in the back, watching. And when the flight landed, something happened that David would remember forever. As they prepared to deboard, the pilot spoke over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, today we were honored to have a fallen soldier on board. We ask that you remain seated as Captain Carter escorts him home." No one moved. Not a single passenger rushed to grab their bags. They waited, in silence, in respect. And as David walked down the aisle, a veteran at the front stood and saluted. Then, one by one, every passenger followed. By the time he reached the door, the entire plane was standing. David's throat tightened. This question mark. This was the honor that soldier deserved. And no airline policy could ever take that away. The airport had changed. Just minutes ago, David stood alone, facing an airline employee who had dismissed him like his request didn't matter. Now, he wasn't alone anymore. The pilot, the corporate manager, and even the passengers had stepped up. The airline had been forced to realize its mistake. The corporate manager finished typing into the system and handed David his ticket. His voice was steady, filled with respect. "Captain Carter, you are now on priority boarding. The airline will also ensure full military honors for the fallen soldier." David nodded. That was all he had wanted. Not attention, not special treatment, just respect. But before he could step away, the airline employee, the same one who had refused him earlier, spoke hesitantly. Her voice was lower now. "Sir, I'm sorry. I didn't realize." David studied her for a second. He could see the regret on her face, the way she shifted uncomfortably under the weight of her mistake. But this wasn't about her. David simply nodded. "Next time, listen." The woman looked down, ashamed. The corporate manager turned to David. "Sir, you'll board first, and I will personally make sure every passenger is aware of the presence of the fallen soldier. We will not let this moment go unnoticed." David exhaled. It was finally being handled the right way. When it was time to board, something unexpected happened. Passengers stood back. No one pushed forward. No one tried to rush past David. They waited, because now everyone knew this wasn't just another flight. The gate agent picked up the microphone. Her voice was softer now, more controlled. "Ladies and gentlemen, before we begin boarding, we ask that you allow Captain Carter to escort a fallen soldier onto this flight first. We appreciate your patience and your respect." Silence. Then, a quiet murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. One by one, passengers stepped aside. A young mother whispered to her child, pointing to David. "This is important." Watch. An older man near the front straightened his back. He didn't say a word. He just removed his hat and held it over his heart. And David, he walked forward, leading the way. This wasn't just about him. This was about the young Marine who had given everything. As David boarded the plane, the flight crew stood near the entrance. They knew what was happening. One of the flight attendants, a woman in her late 50s with graying hair, placed her hand over her heart. "Thank you, sir. And thank you for bringing him home." David nodded. He had seen people react in different ways over the years. But this was genuine. The captain of the flight, the same man who had stood up for him earlier, approached. "Captain Carter, I'll be making an announcement before we take off." David wasn't sure what to say. "An announcement?" The captain gave a firm nod. "Every single person on this flight needs to know who's traveling with us today." David exhaled slowly. He hadn't expected this, but he appreciated it. As he took his seat, something else caught his eye. A young man across the aisle, a Marine, probably in his early 20s, sat up straighter. He didn't say anything, but he understood. Because one day it could be him being escorted home. Right before takeoff, the pilot's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to take a moment before we depart to recognize someone special on today's flight. Seated with us is Captain David Carter, a decorated military officer. But today, he is not flying for himself. He is escorting a fallen soldier home." The entire cabin went still. The captain continued. "This soldier gave his life in service to this country, and tonight he takes his final flight home. We ask that you join us in a moment of silence to honor him." For a brief moment, there was nothing but quiet. No rustling of bags, no chattering, no movement, just respect. David closed his eyes. This was the honor that soldier deserved, and no airline policy could ever take that away. The plane was in the air. The moment of silence had passed, but the feeling still lingered. Passengers were quieter than usual. There were no loud conversations, no impatient sighs. Something had changed. David sat by the window, staring at the clouds. He had escorted fallen soldiers before, but this one felt different. Then a flight attendant approached. She leaned in slightly. "Captain Carter, the passenger in seat 12A asked if he could speak with you." David glanced toward the row she mentioned. A young man sat there, his posture rigid, controlled. A Marine. David nodded. "Of course." The flight attendant stepped aside, and the Marine stood making his way over. He looked no older than 22. He cleared his throat. "Sir, I just wanted to say thank you." David met his eyes. He recognized the weight behind them. "You serve?" David asked. The young Marine nodded. "Just finished my first deployment." He hesitated. This could have been me. David exhaled. He understood. "This will always be the hardest part," David said, "knowing that someone didn't make it home, but we carry them with us." The young Marine nodded. He straightened his back, then, without hesitation, saluted. David returned the salute, his chest tightening, and then quietly, the young Marine said, "I knew him." David's breath caught. David hadn't expected this. "You knew him?" The young Marine nodded. "We trained together. Same unit. He was my friend." David swallowed hard. This wasn't just a soldier. This was a brother in arms. He talked about home all the time, the Marine continued. Said he couldn't wait to see his family again. He paused. He should have been on this flight with me. David felt the weight of those words. It was never fair. It never would be. But this was fate. The Marine took a slow breath. "I didn't get to say goodbye." David didn't hesitate. "You can now." The young Marine stiffened slightly, then nodded. Passengers nearby watched quietly. Some had tears in their eyes. And then the Marine placed his hand over his heart. "I'll carry him with me," he said softly. "Always." David placed a hand on his shoulder. "That's all we can do." The young Marine gave him a firm nod, then returned to his seat. And just like that, a fallen soldier was no longer just a name. He was a friend, a brother, a reminder that every loss is personal. The plane landed, but the moment still hung in the air. As passengers gathered their bags, no one pushed or rushed. They simply waited. The captain's voice came over the intercom once more. "Ladies and gentlemen, we ask that you remain seated as Captain Carter escorts our fallen soldier home." Silence. David stood. The young Marine in 12A stood too. He walked beside David, shoulders squared, eyes forward. When they reached the exit, something happened that no one expected. Airport workers stood at attention. Some saluted. Some placed their hands over their hearts. A baggage handler wiped his eyes. "I was in the Army," he said quietly. "This means everything." David nodded in gratitude. Then, as the casket was unloaded, something even bigger happened. A group of veterans, who'd been waiting nearby, stood in formation. They saluted, holding their stance until the casket was placed in the vehicle. Passengers who had deboarded watched in silence. Some whispered prayers. Others simply stood, hands over their hearts. And as David turned, he saw the young Marine still standing there, shoulders tense, his eyes locked on the casket. David didn't say anything. He didn't have to. Because in that moment, everyone understood. This wasn't just about one soldier. This was about every sacrifice, every life, every name that deserved to be remembered. And no airline policy could ever stand in the way of that. The casket was secured. The honor guards stood still, their postures strong, their eyes filled with respect. The moment had passed, but the weight of it remained. David stood at a distance, watching as the military vehicle prepared to transport the fallen soldier to his final resting place. The young Marine from seat 12A still hadn't moved. His eyes were locked on the casket, his jaw tight, his hands clenched into fists. David understood. "You did right by him," David said quietly. The Marine swallowed, his voice rough. "I should have done more." David shook his head. "You served beside him. You honored him today. That's more than most get." The Marine let out a slow breath. "It just doesn't feel like enough." David placed a hand on his shoulder. "It never does." The young man nodded slowly. "Thank you, sir, for everything." David gave him a firm nod. And with that, they parted ways. David walked through the terminal, past the waiting passengers, the workers, the veterans who had come to show their respects. Some of them stopped him, to shake his hand, to offer a quiet thank you. But there was nothing to thank him for. He had simply done what was right. And yet, in a world where people rushed past each other, where distractions were constant, this moment had forced everyone to slow down, to remember, to honor, to acknowledge a sacrifice they might have otherwise overlooked. As David reached the exit, a familiar voice called out behind him, "Captain Carter." He turned. It was the corporate airline representative, the one who had stepped in earlier to make things right. The man looked nervous. "I just wanted to say, this won't happen again. What happened at check-in, there's no excuse for it. We're reviewing our training policies to make sure all employees understand the importance of honoring fallen soldiers." David studied him for a moment. He wasn't sure if this was just a corporate apology or something real. But then the man added, "We've already reached out to our staff. And, starting today, every flight carrying a fallen soldier will have a moment of honor. Every single one." David nodded. That was what mattered. Not just this soldier, not just this flight, but every single service member who gave their life. "Good," David said simply. The man exhaled, looking relieved. "Safe travels, sir." David gave one last nod before stepping outside, into the world that soldier would never see again. This moment would fade. The passengers would return to their lives. The airport would go back to its routine. The airline would process its mistake and move on. But David knew that for the family of that Marine today would never be forgotten. And for every single person who witnessed this moment, they had changed. Because respect is not about words. It's about actions. And today, actions spoke louder than anything else. And just like that, the journey was over. David had done his duty. He had made sure that young Marine was honored, that his sacrifice was not forgotten. But this wasn't just about one soldier. It was about all of them, every fallen hero, every family who had lost someone, every name etched into history. That's why moments like these matter. Because if we don't stop, if we don't take the time to show respect, then who will? Now, let me ask you, what would you have done if you were in David's place? Would you have fought harder? Would you have walked away? Or would you have handled it just like he did? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I want to hear what you think. And if this story moved you, hit that like button, subscribe, and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Because respect, it isn't about policies or rules. It's about doing the right thing, even when no one is watching. See you in the next one.